Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for standing by. Welcome to the Webinar Wednesday Advocacy and Lobbying Rules for Nonprofits webinar. During the presentation, all participants will be in a listen-only mode. If you'd like to ask a question during the presentation, please use the chat feature located in the lower left corner of your screen. As a reminder, this conference is being recorded Wednesday, December 4th, 2013. I would now like to turn the conference over to Rochelle Seeger. Please go ahead.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much. My name is Rochelle Seeger. I'm the Community Health Research Officer at the Foundation for Healthy Kentucky. Thank you all so much for joining our call today. This webinar is part of the Foundation's Health for a Change training series. This free series is comprised of webinars and in-person workshops designed to support the efforts of Kentucky's community health coalitions, agencies, health advocates, and interested community members just like yourselves. First, I'd like to begin with a brief introduction about the Foundation for Healthy Kentucky. The Foundation was founded in 2001 with a mission to address the unmet healthcare needs of Kentuckians with three main focus areas. First, promoting responsive health policy aims to make public health policy more responsive to the health and healthcare needs of the people of Kentucky. Investing in Kentucky's future aims to improve the health of Kentucky's children by engaging communities in testing innovative strategies. And finally, supporting communities aims to support implementation or expansion of innovative, replicable strategies to improve the health of Kentucky's lower-income communities. The Foundation does this by supporting targeted health and healthcare-related research, providing policymakers with the resources and information needed to make decisions which impact the health of Kentuckians, and by offering training and technical assistance just like this event today. Some of you were with us last month in Lexington for the standing room only Health for a Change training workshop that's pictured here. We had wall-to-wall participants. It was a super day. At this workshop, evaluation experts were featured. They guided us on the basics of building a sound logic model and evaluation planning for our community health projects. It was a super day. Next, I'd like to direct you to the Foundation's website, healthy-ky.org. There you will find archives of past Health for a Change webinars, Foundation reports and issue briefs, the Foundation's annual Kentucky Health Issues Poll reporting, and upcoming event schedule. For those of you passionate about data like I am, I want to highlight the Foundation's most recent event, the Data Forum, held in November. It showcased innovative and effective uses of health data in our area. Keynote speakers there, Dwayne Spradlin from the Health Data Consortium and Damon Davis, Director of the Health Data Initiative at HHS Health and Human Services, gave updates on federal open data efforts. Videos of their keynote addresses as well as a full agenda, the panelists, and the panelists' excellent presentations are all posted to the Foundation's website. As was mentioned, this webinar today will also be recorded and posted to the Foundation's website under Data Reports and Videos. Now on to today's webinar. I'm so honored to introduce Nayantara Mehta, Senior Counsel with Alliance for Justice in Oakland, California, working through the Boulder Advocacy Initiative to support nonprofit advocacy and voter engagement. She provides training and technical assistance to nonprofit and foundation staff and board members on the rules governing advocacy and lobbying. Nayantara holds a JD from University of California, Berkeley School of Law, an MA from the University of Chicago, and a BA from the College of William and Mary. Nayantara, welcome, and thank you for sharing your expertise with us today.
Thanks, Rochelle. Hi, everyone. It's nice to talk to you. I am going to be talking for the next hour or so, hopefully, and also answering some questions from you all about the rules for nonprofits engaging in advocacy. And the reason that Alliance for Justice does these types of trainings and educates nonprofits about these rules is because you all probably know there's a lot of misconception and misunderstanding around exactly what nonprofits can do in terms of influencing policy and getting involved in elections and getting involved in influencing legislation. And as many of you probably already know, but will certainly learn by the end of today's webinar, nonprofits can do a lot around advocacy. And not only can they legally do a lot around advocacy, we think at Alliance for Justice that nonprofits really need to be playing a role in advocating on behalf of the needs of their communities, because if you think about it, people in the state capitals and in Congress and at the local level, policymakers, they're making decisions. They need input from everyone who's affected by those decisions, and nonprofits are often the entities that know the best what issues are facing vulnerable communities or just the communities they work with. So we think it's really important for nonprofits to be playing an active role, to have a voice, and along with that to understand, for nonprofits to understand that they are permitted to do a lot of advocacy. So I want to say at the beginning, before I get into the content, that I'm going to be covering a lot of material. So it's legal content. I understand that you won't necessarily retain every little last detail, and that's totally okay because I want to make sure you know that we offer free technical assistance, follow-up technical assistance where you can call us or email us and ask more detailed questions about something covered today, or if you want to talk about something related but that I didn't cover today, please do feel free to call us. We have an on-call attorney in either our main Washington, D.C. or our California office. Somebody's on call to take questions from the public every day, and we're really happy to have you get to know us as a source of information around these lobbying and advocacy rules, because I admit they can be a little bit confusing, and it's a lot, especially if you're new to this topic, it's a lot to take in at first. So what I often hear from people who've attended trainings or heard the material more than once is that it takes sometimes a couple of hearings in order to really feel like you've got it down, and that's what I just want to make sure you know that is available to you, is the opportunity to follow up after this webinar to ask to have that one-on-one opportunity to ask us questions. So hopefully this is the beginning of our relationship with you if you don't already know us as a resource. So with that, I'm going to get started on just doing a quick overview on what it means to be a 501c3 organization. And I'm guessing that most of you on this call or attending this webinar work for 501c3 organizations. Maybe not all of you. Maybe some of you work with state or county agencies, but I'm guessing you work with a lot of 501c3s. So the content that I'm going to be talking about is particularly applicable today to 501c3 organizations. So whether you work for one, you volunteer for one, or you work with them, hopefully this information will be useful for you. And I should point out that that Rochelle is going to be both Rochelle and I are going to be keeping an eye on the question box. So please do feel free to type your questions in as they come up, and I'll do my best to answer all the questions that come up today. And if necessary, we can follow up afterward. But please do feel free to type in your questions, because this is meant to be an opportunity for you to learn information, but also get your questions answered. So what you should be seeing in front of you is a chart that has columns for 501c3 and 501c4. And those numbers are just sections of the tax code, the federal tax code. So what we commonly refer to as nonprofits, many of us, when we use that term nonprofit, often we're really referring to what are 501c3 nonprofit organizations. But being a nonprofit doesn't automatically mean you're a C3. You could be a 501c4 nonprofit. So you can see there in the example that the Sierra Club is a 501c4, a well-known nonprofit organization. They have an affiliated C3, the Sierra Club Foundation. And we at Alliance for Justice, we're a 501c3. We have an affiliated 501c4 entity called Alliance for Justice Action Campaign. So that's a not uncommon structure where an existing C3 realizes it wants to do more than is permitted by its C3 status, so it may create a C4. And if anyone is interested in exploring that, we are happy to talk with you through our technical assistance service. We have a lot of written resources as well on that C3, C4, how you keep the activities separate, how you keep the finances separate. Why groups want to be 501c3s, why that combination of numbers and letters is significant is that we as C3s have the best tax treatment under tax law. So the IRS, if it approves our application for C3 status, recognizes that we are tax exempt, so meaning we don't pay tax on our income. Contributions to us are tax deductible for the donor. So when we do our fundraising, we can tell donors, please give to us. You can take a deduction on your own taxes. So we give our donors an incentive to give to us because of this tax tax treatment. And the other major benefit of being a C3 in terms of tax treatment is that private foundations, which are actually another type of 501c3, private foundations give grants to 501c3, what are called public charities. That's just the designation that applies to most nonprofits, or public charities. So we as C3s have a lot easier time raising money than non-C3s. And it's certainly not easy to raise money, but it's easier to raise money as a C3 than as a C4, for example. Because if you look over to the next column, C4s, they are tax exempt, meaning they're exempt from paying federal income tax, but contributions to C4s are not tax deductible, and private foundations typically don't give grants to C4s. It's not impossible, but it's usually private foundations only give grants to C3s. And so C4s have to raise money from usually individuals or other sources who just believe in the work of the C4. They don't get any tax benefit from giving to a C4. So C3s have better tax treatment than C4s. The trade-off is we as C3s have really preferential tax treatment. The trade-off is that we agree we are going to keep our lobbying and our electoral activities limited. So we are definitely permitted to lobby. And I'm going to define what I mean by lobbying, but basically it means influencing legislation. There's no question that C3s can lobby. We just have to stay within our annual lobbying limits. And I'll talk about what those limits are in just a moment. And the other area where we have to watch our activities as C3s is that we cannot support or oppose candidates for public office. We can't suggest who is a better candidate. We can't give contributions to candidates on behalf of our C3s. We can't tell people how they should vote when it comes to candidate elections. But we can do all kinds of nonpartisan electoral activities like voter registration drives and encouraging people to educate themselves about what the candidates are saying, candidate forums, that sort of thing. So there's a lot we can do as C3s around elections, but we absolutely cannot support or oppose candidates for public office. C4s, in contrast, have fewer limits. They can do unlimited lobbying. So they can spend all their resources on influencing legislation, and some of them do. That's why some C4s exist, to influence legislation. They can also support or oppose candidates for public office as a secondary activity. And so those are the major differences between being a 501c3 and 501c4. And I'm going to come back to that highlighted section of the chart there, the lobbying limits. That's where we're going to be spending most of our time in the next approximately 45 minutes. But before we do that, I just want to contextualize. Before I get into the lobbying definition, I want to put it into a larger context. And the title slide, a couple slides back, it's called Advocacy and Lobbying Rules for Nonprofits. And I just want to make clear that when I use the term lobbying, I'm using a fairly specific, narrow term. Lobbying is at least in the context of the IRS rules for 501c3s, lobbying is a very specifically defined activity. Lobbying is one form of advocacy. So I think it's just important to point out that lots of organizations are advocacy organizations, even though they might not think of themselves as advocacy organizations because they think advocacy means lobbying. But I think there's a lot more forms of advocacy than just lobbying. Lobbying is just one way to do advocacy. You can do advocacy in a lot of different ways where basically you're helping to change the way people think about something, you're changing a policy, you're helping people become better educated about the issue you work on. So there's a lot of ways to do advocacy. Many of them are not lobbying. So you see that there are a number of activities listed on the slide in front of you. A number of them most of them are in green. Lobbying is in yellow, partisan political activity is in red. And what I'm trying to convey here with the color scheme is that C3 organizations, even though I just got finished talking about how the trade-off for our tax treatment is that we have some limits on our activities, that's true, but I want to make sure you're aware that as C3s, even though we have limits, there's so many activities that are unlimited that we can engage in without limits. So all the green activities you see there are the ones I'm saying, green light, do these green activities as much as you like. As a C3, there's no limit on how much you can spend on these activities. The two activities that are not in green are lobbying, and of course that's not because you can't lobby. You can certainly lobby as a C3. It's that I'm putting it in yellow, giving it the yellow light treatment, because I want you to remember that you can lobby, but if you lobby, you should just be aware when you're doing it, and then you can keep track of it so that you can report to the IRS every year, here's how much we spent on lobbying. Don't worry, we're within our lobbying limits. So that's why you want to keep track of your lobbying. And the only activity that's absolutely prohibited is partisan political activity. So that's the only activity a C3 cannot engage in at all. But like I said, there's so many nonpartisan political election-related activities that you can engage in. So I'll take a maybe 10-second pause in talking just to check in, see if there are any questions about what I've said so far.
No questions so far. I love this slide. And I'm always thinking about this question. Say my neighbor, and maybe you're going to get to it, my neighbor works for 501c3, and he wants to do some activities that are on your slide. When is he doing activities as an individual, and when would he be doing it as part of his work as a 501c3? And if you're going to answer it later, awesome. But I always think that's kind of where's that dividing line as individual or part of the 501c3 agency?
Yeah, no, that's a great question, and a question that often comes up, especially in the elections context, where I just talked about how we cannot, as C3 representatives using C3 resources, we can't support or oppose candidates, we can't tell people who to vote for, but we don't lose our rights as individuals who work for C3s or volunteer for C3s to support or oppose candidates. So in that case, it's really important to make sure you're not doing it during work hours, not using your work email address. If you're talking evenings or weekends, just doing things in a clear personal capacity. So even probably things like don't wear a T-shirt with your work's logo on it or your work name, your organization's name on it. And the same thing goes for lobbying. If you're lobbying as just an individual who happens to believe in the importance of some legislation, and you want to go do that and not have to count it against your C3's lobbying limit, that's fine, but you just need to make sure you're not doing it on your employer's dime. And if it's something that's closely connected to the work your organization does and your work kind of expects you to do it, I'm not sure it really works to say go do it on your own, because then that seems, if it's part of your job duties, it's probably harder to make that separation. But certainly as an individual who wants to support or oppose candidates or make contributions to candidates, you can do that as an individual. Sometimes the closer, like if you're in a community where people really closely tie you in their minds with, like if you're the leader of an organization or if you're a prominent face of the organization, you just may need to take some extra steps to clarify sometimes when you're speaking publicly. I'm speaking as an individual here. Sometimes those steps feel kind of silly, like you shouldn't need to say that. But I figure it's always better to come out and say things like that rather than create confusion in people's minds. Okay, I'm going to get into the lobbying rules and talk about how much 501c3s can lobby, what exactly is lobbying. Before I do that, I'm going to say a little bit about those organizations that receive government funds. And I'm just going to say a few words about that, just a few slides about it. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time. I think you all have access to the presentation afterward, or to a version of the presentation. So I just mainly wanted you to have this information to think about more a little bit later. But this is the message that I would like you to leave with, which is nonprofits can and should advocate and lobby for policy change. I'm going to be getting into, like I warned you before, some kind of technical stuff, and I don't want anyone to feel put off or scared by feeling overwhelmed by assimilating all this new information. This is the important message, that if you work for a nonprofit, you can and should advocate and lobby. The details around what source of funds you can use and how much you can do, those are things that we can help you deal with. But this is the important message, that you can do it, and it's of course important to understand the legal rules and implications. But this is the underlying message, I think, that we can do it, and there's a way to figure out how to do it. I said I'm going to talk about the organizations that receive government funds, I'm specifically talking about organizations that receive federal funds here. So these are just some general tips, that generally if you receive federal funds, you can't lobby with those funds. So even though you're a 501c3, you can lobby legally as part of your C3 status. You can't lobby with federal funds. If funding comes from state sources, then the rules may be different. And so it's important to know where the funds come from and what restrictions attach to those funds. Unfortunately, there's no one-size-fits-all answer. The federal funds, I'm going to go into the rules a little bit just now, but sometimes your state funds may come from federal sources, so then the federal funds rules will apply as well. So I would just suggest if you're using a lot of government funds and trying to figure out what you're allowed to do, go back to the award letter and see what they say about lobbying or influencing legislation. That's the best source of information. And different rules apply if you work for a state or local government, if you work for a nonprofit, colleges and universities. So to ask your employer to hopefully if you're with a state or local government, there's a general counsel you can ask. If you're a nonprofit, you can ask leadership in your organization. And then, of course, for 501c3s, you have to follow the IRS rules and definitions, and that's what we're going to be spending most of our time talking about. But before I get to those IRS definitions, I just want to flag for you that if you're a recipient of federal funds, the basic rule is you cannot seek reimbursement for certain activities. And basically that means you cannot use federal funds for certain activities. And right in front of you is a slide that refers to the OMB, which stands for Office of Management and Budget, the Federal Office of Management and Budget Circular A87. And that's the circular, that's the guidance that applies to state and local governments receiving federal funds. I'm not planning on going into any detail on this. I just wanted to flag this for any of you who work for state and local government. If you receive federal funds, OMB Circular A87 is where you would find information about what you're allowed to do. And basically, if you're a state or local government receiving federal funds, you're not allowed to use those federal funds for obtaining grants, contracts, cooperative agreements, or loans. Also, common recipients of federal funds are nonprofits. And the guidance from the Office of Management and Budget that applies to nonprofits receiving federal funds is called OMB Circular A122. And again, I'm not planning on going into any detail here. I just wanted to flag if you're a nonprofit that receives federal funds, this is an important resource to know about so that you can look at your grant agreement from the government source and refer back to OMB Circular A122 to clarify what you are and are not allowed to do. But in a nutshell, you're not allowed to spend federal funds to influence federal or state legislation. You're not allowed to engage in direct and grassroots lobbying. There are some exceptions. You're allowed to use federal funds for certain activities. There you can see on the bottom left of the slide where reimbursement is allowed, meaning you can use federal funds for certain things. And this circular goes into a pretty good amount of detail in talking about what those exceptions are. Another basic rule is that you are not permitted to lobby with federal funds for more federal funds. And this derives from something called the Byrd Amendment. And again, just a basic kind of across-the-board rule that applies to recipients of federal funds. So I really just whizzed through that material. If people have questions, if you want to type them in, I'm happy to come back to this topic. But where I wanted to spend the rest of the hour, the next half hour or so, is talking about the rules for 501c3 organizations, the IRS rules, because it's really important for C3s to know that they are allowed to lobby, and that while yes, there are some lobbying limits imposed by the IRS, the limits are fairly generous, and 501c3s can definitely lobby. Again, as long as you have some unrestricted sources of funding. So if you have a lot of government funding, I would again suggest you go back and look at what the agreements, the contracts, or the award letters say about lobbying. And if you have private foundation grants, you may want to go back and check and see what they say about lobbying. But as long as you have some unrestricted sources of funding, individual donations, unrestricted foundation grants, other maybe member dues, as long as you have some unrestricted sources of funding, there's no question that you can lobby. You can lobby with those funds. And I talked about the fact that C3s can lobby within limits. And I'm not going to talk about how you figure out what your limits are. So you know you're a C3, you know you can lobby, but you need to figure out how much you can lobby. And I'm going to talk about the limits before I get into the definition of lobbying. And the reason for that is because the definition of lobbying, what the IRS considers to be lobbying for a C3, is going to depend on how you calculate your lobbying limits. And this is because the IRS offers two options for calculating your lobbying limits as a 501c3. The first option, and actually I shouldn't even call this an option because it's the default, but I'll call it an option. The first option is the insubstantial part test, where the IRS says, okay, 501c3s, you can lobby, but lobbying must be an insubstantial part of your activities. And then does not actually define what they mean by that. They don't actually say insubstantial equals 10% or 5% or 15% or 20%. They just say lobbying has to be an insubstantial part of your activities. And there are some old court cases that have said in one particular outcome court decision, the court said 5% of an organization's overall activities spent on lobbying, that's insubstantial. So a lot of lawyers who represent nonprofits will say if you're going to use this insubstantial part test, keep your lobbying to 5% or less of your overall activities. That's probably safe, even though the IRS has never confirmed that 5%. They've just said insubstantial. And like I mentioned before, it's the default test, meaning if you're a 501c3 and you do nothing else, if you don't choose the second test that I'm about to talk about, then this insubstantial part test applies to you. And you can certainly lobby, but we're not totally clear how much you can lobby. We're not totally clear how much you can lobby. Also, the IRS doesn't really give a clear definition of lobbying. So again, you can lobby. Lobbying is generally influencing legislation, but the IRS doesn't give a whole lot of clarity around how much you can lobby and what exactly is and isn't lobbying. And I know that doesn't sound very appealing because I'm telling you, great, you should lobby, but I'm saying the IRS doesn't tell you how much. The IRS does tell you how much in the second option, the 501h expenditure test. But in order to have that clarity from the IRS about how much you can lobby, you actually have to fill out a really simple IRS form called IRS Form 5768. It's a one-page form. There's not even one page of form. It's a couple of lines and you check a box and send it into the IRS. It's really simple. It's probably easier than any IRS form you've ever seen. And I strongly recommend if you're a 501c3 that you fill out this form. And the reason for that is because once you do that, you're under what the IRS calls the 501h expenditure test. And you get a clear definition of lobbying, you get a clear formula for figuring out how much you can lobby, and all the IRS cares about, all they want to see when you report your lobbying at the end of the year on your 990 form is how much did you spend on lobbying. And what that means is if you have a board that's active or if you have a lot of volunteers speaking up on behalf of your organization's issues, traveling to the Capitol to do some lobbying, if your organization didn't spend money on it, even though it's technically lobbying, if you didn't spend money on it, it doesn't count against your lobbying limit. So that's a great way to have an important role, an influential role in influencing policy is to use free labor of your board of directors, or to use your committed volunteers or members to lobby on your organization's behalf. But if you didn't pay them anything, it's not going to cost you anything. Though if you reimburse them for mileage, let's say, or paid for some other costs, travel costs related to their lobbying visit, that would be your expenditure. But if they're paying out of their own pockets and they just really believe in the message and it doesn't cost you anything, that's great. It's lobbying, but it doesn't count against your lobbying limit. So we really recommend that C3 organizations do what's called make the 501h election, choose the 501h expenditure test, because you have a lot more clarity around how much you can lobby. And I'm going to use this as an opportunity to pause and check and see if anyone has any burning questions about the 501h expenditure test. If this is something you've considered, if you want to type in the chat box. If it's something you've heard of, if you're considering it, if you have any qualms about it.
Yes, participants can chat in their questions, but I think everyone heard me chuckle when you said going through some of the definitions and talking about the easy IRS form. But the other important thing that occurred to me is that organizations like you and you are here, and your lawyers are here to help us through this process. So it shouldn't prevent us from doing what we feel passionate about and making some change and learning about all of this. The easy IRS form, I didn't. It's kind of an oxymoron, but that's great.
You didn't know it existed, right?
right, super. All right.
And I'll just say to everyone that occasionally we hear, like I explain this differences between the insubstantial part test and the 501H expenditure test to groups, and strongly encourage almost everyone to use the 501H expenditure test. And occasionally somebody will have questions like, well, what if by sending in this form we're telling the IRS we're planning on lobbying? Are they going to come investigate us? And the IRS has specifically said that you're at no greater risk of being audited if you submit this form, if you tell them you want to use the 501H expenditure test. All you're doing is notifying them you're taking advantage of an opportunity available to you. And frankly, I feel like if you don't take advantage of this opportunity, it's something that we wish was not a step you had to take. We wish the IRS would just make this the automatic option, that you have a clear formula for how much you can lobby and what exactly is and isn't lobbying, but it's not the default. So you do have to take this extra step. And I know sometimes people hear this information and they'll go back to their organization or they'll talk to their board and just to get their sign off on it. And sometimes the board will have questions, or there will be some maybe don't totally understand why this is helpful. And we are more than happy to have conversations with board members or just have follow-up conversations to basically say what I'm saying, which is that the 501H expenditure test, it's just a tool available to C3s to maximize how much they can spend on influencing policy. And getting back to the message from before, I really think that if you work on an issue and there's legislation that affects your issue, like almost every issue I can think of, legislation that our state legislature and local legislature and Congress, legislation affects all of us, and it's really important for us to be the voice for our communities. And so this 501H expenditure test gives us some clarity around how much of that we can do. And I saw that a question had come in about, does a 501c4 need to complete the 5768? And the answer, that's an easy answer. It's no, because 501c4s don't have any lobbying limits. So they can spend all their resources on lobbying. Therefore, they don't need to choose the option to tell them how much they can lobby because they have no lobbying limit. So this Form 5768 is only actually even possible for 501c3s. So again, happy to have this same conversation. I say it a lot to a lot of different audiences because I think it's really helpful for C3s. And I'm now going to get into the lobbying definition. How exactly does the IRS define lobbying? And these definitions apply to 501c3 organizations, but 501c3 organizations that use that 501H expenditure test. You may remember, I'll just go back to the last slide quickly. Under that insubstantial part test, the IRS doesn't give us any clear lobbying definition. So I couldn't tell you in any great detail what the IRS considers to be lobbying and what it considers to be non-lobbying under the insubstantial part test. So another reason to fill out that Form 5768 is that you get to use these definitions I'm just about to get into. And when I say use these definitions, I mean when you do the activity that meets these definitions, when you engage in direct lobbying or grassroots lobbying as the IRS defines it, you simply keep track of it. You keep track of how much you're spending, how much money you're spending, or how much time you're spending, paid staff time, and that translates into a percentage of your salary. You keep track of that and add it all up, and then that's the way that you can confirm both to yourself and to the IRS on your 990 form that you have not exceeded your lobbying limit for the year. Okay, so I'm going to get into the definitions now, direct and grassroots lobbying. And I'm going to start out with direct lobbying. Direct lobbying occurs when you have a communication with a legislator that expresses a view about specific legislation. And I'm going to go into each of those pieces of the definition. And the communication piece is very straightforward. Any form of communication, phone calls, in-person visits, letters, faxes, emails, tweeting at a legislator, writing on their Facebook timeline, all ways of communicating are communication, of course. So there's any way you get a message across is going to count as a communication. So that part's easy, knowing what a communication is. Who is a legislator? I've mentioned before, I've talked about Congress and your state legislature and local legislature, and that's because the IRS considers members of legislative bodies at every level of government, federal, state, or local, or local, to be legislators. So it's who you would expect. If you think back to the three branches of government, legislative, executive, and judicial, it's the members of the legislative branch, members of Congress at the federal level, members of the state legislature. And it's also going to include their staff, because often you'll be talking to staff as opposed to directly with legislators. And I'm sure many of you, those of you who communicate with your elected representatives, you've experienced this before, that you'll often talk to the staff expert on the issue that you work on. So the IRS considers members of these bodies and their staff to be legislators. Pretty straightforward. So usually you know when you're talking to a legislator, it's somebody who's in the legislative body. Occasionally, somebody else may be considered a legislator, and that's in very narrow circumstances. So somebody like President Obama, when he's signing or vetoing legislation, is going to be considered a legislator. If you're talking to him and you're saying, please sign this legislation or please veto this legislation. Same goes for your governor or depending on the powers of a mayor in a city. So communicating with the chief executive, like the president, about influencing legislation, signing or vetoing legislation or shaping legislation, he'll be a legislator in those narrow circumstances. But usually he's not. Usually he's the head of the executive branch, again thinking back to those three branches of government. Another time where communicating with President Obama around his staff around legislation would have been around the formulation of the Affordable Care Act, if you were an organization that weighed in on that at all. Same goes with communicating with somebody like the Secretary of Health and the Department of Health and Human Services, Kathleen Sebelius. Usually she's not a legislator. She works in the executive branch of government. Again, thinking back to the three branches of government, she is in the executive branch. Occasionally, if you're talking to her, if you weighed in with her, for example, around the Affordable Care Act before it was passed, and you talked about the need for this or that, then it would be communicating with her in her legislative capacity, because she has the ability to influence that legislation. But usually she's not a legislator. And if you're talking to her about implementation of the Affordable Care Act, then that's not going to be talking to her in a legislative capacity. Once the law is passed, the legislation's done, and you've now moved into a post-legislative period. And working at the state level to, let's say, set up the healthcare exchange in Kentucky, working with state legislators or high-level executive officials around the legislation, the state legislation that set up the exchange in Kentucky, that's the sort of thing that might have been lobbying. Again, totally fine if you were doing that. That's great if you were doing that. It just counts toward your lobbying limit. Some officials who don't count as legislators, the IRS has identified as special purpose bodies or administrative bodies. And the IRS has specifically said entities like school boards, zoning boards, housing authorities, these are not legislative bodies. So these are bodies that work especially at the local level. If you're working with these bodies on policies that they issue or decisions that they issue, then you're not going to be lobbying in the view of the IRS. So these expenditures won't count toward your annual lobbying limit. And then finally, wrapping up, who is a legislator? Who does the IRS consider to be a legislator? In states where there are ballot measures, and I think there's ballot measures or local bond measures, if voters are deciding on tax increases, constitutional amendments, if the public is voting on those, then the IRS considers the public to be the legislator. the legislative body. The public is actually acting just like legislators do in the State House. They are voting yes or no on whether a measure will become law or not. They are voting yes or no on a proposed tax increase. So when a C3 organization communicates to the public, they're communicating to legislators. They are communicating directly to the legislative body, the public, voting public. And so working for or against a ballot measure counts in the IRS's view as lobbying. And that's something that a lot of organizations are surprised by. They don't necessarily think of their ballot measure work as lobbying, but the IRS considers it to be. If you're taking a position on legislation, ballot measures are a form of legislation, therefore you're engaging in lobbying activity. Perfectly legal, fine, important to be doing, just counts toward your lobbying limit. Okay, so that is who is a legislator. The last piece of the definition. It's not lobbying every time you talk to a legislator, because you could just be talking to a legislator and introducing them to their constituents, talking about a program you work on, talking about needs in the community. If you're not expressing a view about specific legislation, then you're not lobbying. You're just communicating with a legislator or educating a legislator. In order for that communication to count as lobbying, direct lobbying, in the IRS's view, you have to be expressing a view about specific legislation. You have to be telling them what you think about legislation, either asking them to vote for it, vote against it, or maybe even asking them to introduce legislation. And so what counts as specific legislation is anything that's been introduced that has a number assigned to it. So if you're saying to your member of Congress, I think you should vote for Senate Bill 729, you're engaging in direct lobbying. And that's great if you have want to share your opinion. If all we're talking about is how much your organization spent, if you're sending an email or writing a letter, it's going to cost very little. So technically, while it may meet the definition of lobbying, that would be a lobbying communication, the cost is going to be very low. The budget also counts as legislation. So if you weigh in on the budget and you urge certain things, certain appropriations to be made a certain way, or protest proposed cuts to a program that you rely on, that's a very important role for nonprofits, and it's generally going to count as lobbying. So again, all that means is you keep track of the time and money you're spending on that and add that up and count it toward your annual lobbying limit. And I want to flag here that I gave you the example of a specific Senate bill and the budget, but the IRS also considers specific legislation to be proposed legislation. So even if nothing's already been introduced, so the bill, let's say you have a great idea, like this guy, he's got a light bulb, great idea going off over his head. He's got a great idea for legislation. He asks for a meeting with his legislator and says, I think we need legislation that does X, Y, and Z. Maybe we need to fund this program by raising the tax on cigarettes by 30 cents or something like that, like something very specific he wants to see. That's even though nothing's been introduced yet, even though the legislator hasn't agreed to introduce anything, if you are asking a legislator to introduce something or urging them to do something like that, then that's going to count as a direct lobbying communication. And again, that's totally fine if it's direct lobbying. All that means is you keep track of the time and money you're spending. It's not lobbying when you work on regulations or executive orders or enforcement of existing laws or implementation of existing laws or litigation. If you file a lawsuit or submit a friend of the court brief in a lawsuit, even a lawsuit that's challenging a law that was passed. So there are a lot of ways that C3 organizations can influence policy, and of course that's very clear in the context of the Affordable Care Act, because that was a huge effort to get it passed by groups that were working on it, but passage in Congress was just the first step. There's all sorts of implementation that has to happen, and all the post-legislative implementation is very important to actually see a law that's passed actually be carried out and make sure that it's reaching people the way it's supposed to be reaching people. All that post-legislative work is not going to be lobbying. So that's a great way for 501c3s to get involved in shaping policy, in making sure that laws that were passed are actually helping the community you work with, but it's not going to be lobbying because the legislation has already been passed. So therefore, it doesn't count against your annual lobbying limit. Okay, I'm going to get into the definition of grassroots lobbying right now, and this will take less time because we've already covered most of the elements of lobbying, but I'll just talk about how grassroots lobbying is different from direct lobbying. But before I do that, I'm going to pause for just a second to see if there's any questions.
I wanted to ask a quick question about the cost. So you mentioned sending an email would be low cost. What are all the costs that would need to be counted towards your lobbying limits? Travel, what all goes into that calculation?
Yeah, that's a great question. You may remember that when I talked about why I think you should use the 501h expenditure test, I said all the IRS cares about is how much did you spend on lobbying. And so the things that you spend on where the lobbying expenditures come from are exactly what you said, Rochelle, which is travel costs for a lobbying visit, portion of paid staff time spent on lobbying. And that's just to acknowledge the fact that if you are lobbying during working hours, and especially if you're salaried and a non-exempt, or excuse me, an exempt employee, meaning you're not an hourly employee, it's hard to separate. Sometimes hard to separate it out when you're on working hours and when you're not. But if you're lobbying on behalf of the organization, and it's clear you're doing it in your work capacity, some portion of your salary is being spent by the organization on lobbying, which is, again, totally fine. The organization just needs to account for that. And so generally that means that it's a good idea for organizations that have staff who lobby would maybe want to consider keeping timesheets. You don't have to keep timesheets, but that's an easy way to just add a line for direct and grassroots lobbying onto your timesheet, and there you can track how did you spend 30 minutes this day on lobbying, an hour, 2 hours, whatever it was. And every so often throughout the year, somebody responsible for keeping on top of your organization's lobbying limit will add up travel expenses, will add up staff time, figure out what percentage of staff time was spent on lobbying, let's say in a quarter. And so let's say I'm keeping track of my lobbying hours and I submit them on my timesheets. Whoever is dealing with our lobbying reporting would look and see, okay, I've spent 10% of my time in this particular quarter on direct lobbying, therefore 10% of what I was paid in that quarter should be allocated to lobbying as a lobbying cost, and add up everyone's staff time who's doing that, travel costs as well. And then also it's important to think about the fact that if a few of us in the organization are lobbying, we're using the things like furniture and office supplies and computers and things like that. And so we think it's important to also capture a little portion of overhead costs and allocate those to lobbying as well. And the way we would suggest capturing that portion of overhead costs is saying what percentage of overall staff time was spent on lobbying. Either you gather that information through timesheets or people keep some other kind of log of their lobbying time. And then say, okay, 5% of staff time this quarter was spent on lobbying, on direct lobbying. Therefore, 5% of our overall overhead costs should be attributed to lobbying. So you just add that up. And I know I've made that sound like it's really simple, but it requires setting up a system where you're tracking for this sort of thing. And we actually have a publication on our website called Keeping Track that goes into what I've just said in more detail, and of course it's in writing, so you'd have it in front of you. Okay, I'm going to now get into the definitions of grassroots lobbying. And grassroots lobbying has something in common with direct lobbying in that you, of course, have a communication expressing a view about specific legislation. But this time it's to the general public, and you have to have a call to action. If you don't have that call to action, it's not going to be lobbying when you're talking about public communications. And the way the IRS defines a call to action is, you can see it on the screen in front of you. There's only, in the IRS's view, 4 types of calls to action, where you're telling people, contact your legislator, or tell the legislature, some verb like that. Providing contact information for the legislature or for particular legislators. Providing a mechanism or a means for the public to communicate with legislators. And I'm going to give you examples of these. or just identifying, here are the legislators who are voting on this bill, or here's who hasn't yet made up their minds, without coming out and saying, we want you to contact them. Any one of these is a call to action. If you include that in your public communication expressing a view about specific legislation, that makes that public communication grassroots lobbying. Again, perfectly fine. All that means is you keep track of the staff time and any other associated costs of putting together this communication. Like if you sent out a mailing, then you'd keep track of the staff time spent creating the mailing, and then paper, printing, postage, all that sort of thing, if it's a lobbying communication. But if it's an email communication, it's going to be very inexpensive. Just keep track of some staff time and a tiny portion of overhead costs. Here's an example of a couple of calls to action. So this is an action alert about the DREAM Act. Call Congress, call your respective senators and House members now, and it gives the phone numbers. So this is a very straightforward example of grassroots lobbying. It's an email, a public communication, expressing a view about specific legislation, and it has a couple of calls to action. It says call Congress. It says call your senator, House member, and it gives their phone numbers. So this has a couple of calls to action, and once you're going to go ahead and engage in grassroots lobbying, you may as well include a couple of calls to action. There's no harm. It doesn't cost you any more. Here's another example of grassroots lobbying. This is a communication to the public, and it provides the public with a sample message. It wrote up what it suggests the public send to their member of Congress. And I'm sure you've received these, and maybe you even send these types of things out where you say, here's some sample language you can use, or you can write what you'd like to write. But you're making it easy for people to send the message that you hope that they send to their member of Congress or to their other legislator. And the mechanism here is there's a form that the person receiving this email fills out their name, it fills out their address, and then the program knows where they live, and therefore they know who their elected representative is. So they can send this message on the person's behalf about this legislation, and this is the C3 organization here sending this email is engaging in grassroots lobbying. They have sent out a grassroots lobbying communication to the public. It includes a mechanism, this form where people can fill out their name and address. It includes that mechanism for people to communicate with their legislators. And then that last call to action where you're not specifically saying, please contact these people, here's their phone number, you're just saying, here are the people who are voting, or here are the people who haven't yet made up their minds. So again, these are calls to action. If you have them along with your public communication expressing a view about specific legislation, you have a grassroots lobbying communication. And no need to panic. All that means is you counted toward your grassroots lobbying limit for the year. What I think is kind of key here under this definition of grassroots lobbying is that if you don't have the call to action, you don't have a lobbying communication because you're missing one of the pieces of the definition of grassroots lobbying. You have to have all the pieces of the definition. And I have an example here. Sorry if it's a little bit hard to read the faded out part, but I have the call to action highlighted here. So it says on the left there, the more these cost, the less they'll smoke. Tell the legislature, raise the cigarette tax. Call the Maine legislature, and it gives phone numbers for the House and for the Senate. Protect our kids, not big tobacco. In this particular communication, I'm assuming it's to the public. It looks like maybe an email or an ad in a newspaper. So this is a public communication, so I'm thinking already if it's any kind of lobbying, it's going to be grassroots lobbying because it's a public communication. We've got that part down. Maybe it's grassroots lobbying. Does it express a view about specific legislation? Hopefully you'll see the answer is yes. It's talking about the cigarette tax, which is currently in the legislature. And does it have a call to action? That's the final piece. And the answer to that is yes. It says tell the legislature. It says call the Maine legislature. It gives 2 phone numbers. So it has a couple of calls to action. This is grassroots lobbying. Very straightforward. The organization putting this out just keeps track of the cost of creating this and the cost of sending it out. If you emailed it out, the costs are going to be very low. If you put an ad in a local publication, the cost will be higher. Or if you put an ad at a bus shelter, the cost will be higher. So whatever your actual costs were, if you're a C3 and you're using that 501H expenditure test, that's what you keep track of. Let's say though that you have a grant from a private foundation that says you may not lobby, but you still want to get the word out about this issue, this important issue. So what I've done here is it still says the more these cost, the less they'll smoke, raise a cigarette tax, protect our kids not big tobacco, but there's no call to action. And when I use this example, a lot of times people say, well, it says raise a cigarette tax. Isn't that a call to action? And I would say that it's not how the IRS defines a call to action. And this is where it's really helpful to have clarity around the IRS's view on things, because the IRS only considers it a call to action if it's one of those four communications I mentioned before. Tell the legislature, call the legislature, providing phone numbers, providing a way to get in touch. All this says is raise a cigarette tax. It doesn't tell people what to do with that. It just talks about the importance of raising the cigarette tax. It talks about what they think will happen if the cigarette tax is raised, that young people will smoke less. It's not grassroots lobbying, according to the IRS definition. It's not any kind of lobbying, assuming it's a public communication. So I've just said that this is not any kind of lobbying if it's a public communication. However, if you printed these out and mailed them directly to legislators, then you're communicating with a legislator and you're expressing a view about specific legislation. And the same communication would be direct lobbying. So the audience matters. Who are you talking to? Are you talking to the public or are you talking directly to legislators? And that's going to determine whether it's direct lobbying, grassroots lobbying, or any kind of lobbying. And I have two more examples that I like, but I'm going to skip over them and we'll see if we have time, because I want to just make sure I don't keep you past the hour. I want to flag that there are 4 lobbying exceptions. There are 4 activities the IRS has said, if you do these activities, you're not lobbying. And what is really helpful is that means the money you spend on these activities don't count against your lobbying limit, and if you have a grant from a private foundation that says you may not lobby with this grant, these activities are by definition not lobbying activities. So you can use those restricted grants to spend on these activities, and you're not violating the terms of your grant agreement because you're not lobbying. So again, this is helpful to get into the details on what the IRS considers lobbying, because that allows you to think strategically about how to spend restricted foundation dollars. And we're just maybe 1 minute away from the top of the hour, so I just wanted to flag that I think the 2 exceptions that are probably most useful for C3s are nonpartisan analysis, study, or research, and the request for technical assistance. And that nonpartisan analysis exception usually results in some sort of report or white paper or something, and the IRS says it has to have a full and fair discussion of the issue. But you can take a position on legislation, you can send it to the public, you can send it to legislators, and it won't count as lobbying. And the other exception that I think is potentially quite useful is the request for technical assistance, which is where you receive an invitation in writing from a legislator to present your views on legislation, so your views on behalf of your C3. You don't have to count your travel costs as lobbying costs if you get this written invitation. And this may come up in the context of there's a legislative committee that's discussing some legislation and deciding whether to pass the legislation out of the committee. That could be a really good opportunity for you to weigh in and provide your expertise, but you do have to have that written invitation. And I know I went through those last 2 pretty quickly, but I'm going to show you in just a moment where you can read a little bit more about these exceptions. But what I want to leave you with is this basic message that you can, if you're a C3, you can and should think of lobbying as something you are permitted to do and is something that is important for you to do. You just want to, as a C3, stay within your lobbying limit. Using that 501H expenditure test makes planning and tracking lobbying much simpler, because like I said, you have the clear percentages for how much you can spend on lobbying. You have clear definitions of lobbying. You only have to keep track of your lobbying expenditures. And finally, just be aware of government funding restrictions, but you can generally still lobby with other non-governmental funding sources. So just become familiar with the language in award letters and grant agreements to figure out whether you're permitted to lobby, and see if you can find unrestricted sources of funds, or maybe even if you get a restricted grant from a foundation that says you cannot lobby, maybe you can talk to your program officer and ask them to take out those lobbying restrictions. Those are conversations we are happy to have with you to help you prepare for that, or even to have you refer your program officer at the private foundation to us to talk about why they may want to consider taking out restrictive grant language. These are two publications that cover what I just talked about in much greater detail. Being a Player is about the IRS lobbying definitions and limits, and that publication on the right, Keeping Track, is about setting up a system to keep track of your lobbying. These last two slides I'm just skipping right over because they are really detailed, and I mainly included them just so you have them, just so you know a little bit more information about various government sources of funding and what restrictions attach. So I'm leaving you with my content on how to contact us. And with that, I'm sorry I went over by a couple minutes. I will stop talking and let Rochelle wrap up.
Thanks so much, Nayatara. Lots of expertise you shared with us today. Great information. I appreciate your time. And thank you for all the participants joining us today. Please remember these free resources are part of the Foundation's Health for a Change training series. We will post this webinar and all the associated slides and contact information on our website, healthy-ky.org. Please, if you would this afternoon, take a moment to complete the post-event survey which you'll receive in your email, and send us your thoughts on today's events. And I always welcome your ideas for additional trainings as part of the Health for a Change series for the 2014 calendar. Thanks again. I'm Rochelle Seeger with the Foundation for a Healthy Kentucky, and we're so glad you joined us today. Thanks again.
Ladies and gentlemen, that does conclude the webinar for today. We thank you for your participation and ask that you please disconnect your line.